So a lot of things going on. Which brings me to the introduction of our reader tonight. So I've been looking forward to this a great deal. Paul Merchant's Some Business of Affinity, 2007, a finalist for the Oregon Book Award in Poetry that year, follows his three earlier collections, Saltwater Island and Bone from a Stag's Heart from Five Seasons Press, and Stones, published by Rosemont Press. He's also the translator of three collections of modern Greek poetry, include Monochords by Yanis Ritsos. Paul is a linguist. He's a native of Wales and studied at Cambridge, the Shakespeare Institute, and the University of Athens, and taught for 14 years at the University of Warwick. Since 1997, he's been the director of the Stafford Archives in Portland and co-edited with Vince Wixon 2 collections of Stafford's prose. He also edited plays by the early 17th century English dramatist Thomas Heywood, a collection of essays on contemporary American writer Wendell Berry, and with Doug Erickson and Jeremy Skinner, 2 publications relating to Jefferson and the Lewis and Clark expedition. He is currently Special Collections Associate at Lewis and Clark here. It's been a real pleasure for me to get to know Paul a little bit more in preparing for this reading. I'm really excited about it, so would you join me in welcoming our poet tonight, Mr. Paul Merchant. Paul.
Thank you very much, Tom. There are seats up the front here, actually, if people want to use them. Tom, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and I'm really honoured to be invited to read in this series. This feels like a group of friends, but it also it feels intimidating, like the top tier of Oregon poetry in here, and so I've been a little nervous coming up to this reading. I'd like to begin with, thank you also to Milwaukee, and Greg, thank you for the invitation here. I'd like to begin with the broadside. It needs a couple of words of explanation. The 2 halves, the first half is a fairly straight, direct translation from the first epistle of Horace, the Roman poet. It's a fairly familiar passage, actually, from that first epistle. And the second part, it's a description, the second stanza is a description of a Japanese print, a Japanese woodcut by Tachibana Morikuni. 1744 is the date of the woodcut. And I should say one more thing about it. This was written as a letter of friendship to my publisher in England, Glenn Storhook, who's known actually to at least a couple of people in this room. And he, as one of his many interests in life, he works for a botanical web page, as apart from being a rather talented printer. And for this botanical web page, he wanted to find the blue flower that only exists now in one garden in Britain, and it was brought over by Gertrude Jekyll into Britain, and she found it in China. And it had been lost in China, and he decided to find it again. And he went into China, into the mountains in the west of China, and actually found this blue flower blooming in secret in the mountains. And he made a wonderful film about this, which I have. So that's the reason for the blue flower. Talking about retirement with Horace and Morikuni. The city beckons. Shall we surrender to its embrace? That tough hug cracks ribs. My fellow citizens ask themselves why I like to stroll through their porticos, but show no sympathy for their views. Who would not thrill to their enthusiasms, feel contempt for last month's favourites? A bedridden lion once invited a careful fox to his den. No thanks, said the fox. The footprints all go in, but none come out. Imagine a mountain in the south country, a high valley where the blue flower blooms in secret. Every character draws from solitude. Alongside the hut, the path climbs out of sight. Time is measured drop by drop in the unending thunder of the waterfall's cataract. If you remember the little hut, the flower, the waterfall, the path, you know how very good it is to pass unnoticed. I want to talk a number of times today about friendship and the extraordinary friendship one sometimes has with a publisher. My friendship with my British publisher has been unusual, and I'll come back to that. But the next friendship I want to talk about is there are 3 people in this room who have published some of the translations from this book, and I'm grateful to all 3 of you. But these are, I'm going to read the first 15 of Yanis Ritsos's monochords. Yanis Ritsos was one of Greece's great poets. He was really the third of the triumvirate of Seferis and Elitis and then Ritsos. But he was perhaps the most popular of those 3 in Athens. And he wrote a book, in about a month, he wrote a book which is 336, I believe. Yes, 336 one-line poems. He wrote it when he was in exile on the island of Samos. He hadn't found favour with the dictatorship. And these are the first 15 of his one-liners. They're called monochords. With a bird for a pillow, I lie awake night after night. 2. The lamppost, the statue, the flagpole. 3. A white horse in a yellow field. 4. The words left out of the poem are scared. I can't resist commenting on a poem that Greg Chamoff sent me a couple of weeks ago. He'd been reading these poems, and he thought he read that line as being the words left out of the poem are sacred, and which actually may be a better line. And he wrote a very witty poem based on that misreading. Thank you, Greg. 5. I understood the trumpeter when I closed my eyes. 6. Dark glasses for the sun, darker than night. 7. Saturday night, lads with rakish caps and pistachios. 8. If the light bothers you, it's my fault. 9. The miner's alarm clock on his chair. 10. It plucks out some feathers to be lighter. 11. The train's lights welding the track. 12. Sword years, merciful years. 13. Just when the swimmer jumped in, I missed it. 14. In their shoes, banana skins and aspirins. 15. Rumpled sheets and the lights on. No one at home. And it goes on. It's just a series of these little fragments. The last poem in the sequence is kind of revealing. It says, so you'll know these monochords are my keys. Take them. He regarded the book of monochords as the keys to all the themes in his poetry. I'm going to do something a little bit unusual, if I may, now. I want to read you 2 versions of another Ritsos poem. One of the versions was published in this book, Some Business of Affinity. It's the first poem in his great sequence, 12 poems for Cavafy, 12, where he wrote 12. He's one of Greece's great modern poets, writing poems to perhaps Greece's greatest 20th century poet, Constantine Cavafy. And they had a lot in common. They were both of them outsiders. They were both of them on the edge of society. Cavafy was truly gay, and though very reluctant to let people know, and I believe that Ritsos was probably bisexual, but he had a very great sympathy for Cavafy on that score also. And this poem's called The Poet's Place, and I did this translation in 1966. So it's been hanging around, and when it was published in a journal by the poet Ted Hughes, and when he was publishing it, he said, "I'm publishing these, but I want you to know that are the poems, is Ritsos as Latinate as you're making him?" And I was just out of college, and I was writing, I thought Latin was the right sort of tone for a poet like Ritsos. And he is actually rather colloquial, but the thing about Ritsos is he's both colloquial and stately. And so I'd gone for the kind of Latinate version. So here's the Latinate version. Then I've retranslated it last week, and I want you to see what you think is the I mean, one of them may be better than the other. This is called The Poet's Place. It's the first in the sequence. The black carved desk, the 2 silver candlesticks, his red pipe. He sits almost invisible in the armchair, keeping the window always at his back. From behind his spectacles, huge, circumspect, he observes his guest bathed in light. Himself hidden among his words, in history, behind his masks, distanced, invulnerable, capturing others' attention with the subtle glints of a sapphire worn on his finger, the whole time eagerly savouring their expressions, the moment foolish boys moisten their lips with their tongues, amazed. And he, crafty, voracious, sensual, the supreme innocent, between yes and no, desire and repentance, like the scales in God's hand, utterly balanced, while the light from the window behind his head sets on him a crown of pardon and sanctity. If poetry is not absolution, he whispered to himself, we cannot hope for mercy anywhere. And this is an attempt to make him a little more colloquial. The poet's space. The black carved desk, the pair of silver candlesticks, his red pipe. He is sitting, almost unseen, in the armchair, as always with the window at his back. Behind his enormous, cautious spectacles, he watches his visitor bathed in light, himself concealed among his words, within history, behind his masks, distant, unscathed, catching other people's attention with the subtle flashes of a sapphire he wears on his finger, always poised to savour their responses, that moment when naive young men lick their lips with their tongues in surprise. He, meanwhile, crafty, gluttonous, carnal, the great innocent, stays altogether balanced between yes and no, desire and penitence, like the scales God holds in his hand, while the light from the window behind his head casts on him a halo of forgiveness and saintliness. If poetry is not absolution, he whispered to himself, we have no chance of finding mercy anywhere else. I don't know about I feel more sympathy with the second version, but that's because it's the most recent. It's not 40 years old. I'm going to read one more translation, and this is from medieval Welsh. And it's from a poet, Dafydd ap Gwilym, who was, he came in the period between the troubadours, I guess, and Chaucer. So he's actually he's just before François Villon in France, and he sounds a bit like Villon, except that he precedes him. And he's a great dissident poet. He was at his time maybe there weren't all that many poets around actually, and he was one of the great poets of Europe. The troubadours had kind of come and gone, and there he was in Wales, writing in a absolutely unknown language, of course, but he he writes these poems which are ironic self-abasements, really. He's always in trouble, mostly with women. And here he is writing about old age, and this is a very crafty poem in Welsh. It has the same, it's in 2 stanzas with a tiny pair of introductory lines, couplets between entering each stanza. But within the stanza, the first word of each line is the same word all the way through. And he's just playing with that idea. So here we go. It's called Old Age. My heart, vile traitor, began to fail, while passions staged their own rebellion. In 100 disappointments, in the desire of youthful blood, in a tireless young man's vigour, in 2 hands manacled by love, in scant respect for poetry, robed in the shallow bravado of youth, in vanity's all-consuming mirror, in easy exchanges of pleasantries, in health enough, a touch of fame, in laughter, grace, and elegance. So now, grown old, I settle the score, wrinkled and sad, waiting for death. Gone is my old familiar swagger, gone that vigour and that passion, gone the rapid rush of language, gone my triumphs and my failures, gone my verses made for Morfudd, gone hope of fame, all claims of conquests, gone recollection of my poems, gone all jesting, all desire gone, gone our gossip, our boasts of amours, gone all love, unless she beckons. He's very cunning and very surprising quite a lot of the time. I want to talk. Translating is obviously a form of collaboration. One's relying on a poet to do the job for one, but one's also doing a job for them. And that's one form of collaboration. I've loved doing that all my life. Here's another form of collaboration. That's where one encounters another artist, and it doesn't matter actually what medium it's in, but one encounters an artist and they force one to a response. And it's a wonderful thing because, of course, in such a collaboration, if you're exchanging work with someone else, that other person is your absolutely best audience. You'll never get a more attentive audience than that person. This is the first true collaboration I went in for, and it's I had a sculptor colleague, actually a ceramic artist called David Jones, and he has since become a very celebrated British raku artist. But I knew him when he was beginning to do raku, which is to rapid fire a pot in a direct flame from greenware right to the finished pot in the flame. You're putting it into the flame and you're taking it out of the flame with tongs. And we watched him. We helped him build a kiln, and we actually fired that kiln with open gas cylinders in the back garden, and no one died. It's amazing. And but what he did in these, he did a whole series of pieces which he called. I think he called them raku pieces, or what was it called now? Anyway, what he would do is, when the clay was still wet, he'd make a pot, and then which might be a bowl or a pillar or whatever, and he'd slam his fist into it and distort it. And there were these wonderful distorted pieces. And then he'd fire them, and the distortion then, of course, is permanent. And I thought, how wonderful, how absolutely inventive that was, and how immediate it was. And I wondered if poetry could be done like that. And I was just the wrong person to try. As you've probably already gathered, I try to know where I'm going with the poem, and the idea of being absolutely at the poem's mercy was really strange to me. But he was doing that with clay, and so I thought, well, why not try that? So I did a few sketches to go with his pots, and this is a few of them. 1. A magpie drops through the sycamore branch to branch, the last leaf. A dark side, a flash of white, a dark side. I'm not ready for this. She rose from the water. It streamed about her like silk. She called for the soap, made a clean catch. I saw sparrows fill a holly tree one white summer day, each little bullet disappearing into the dark. Hundreds of sparrows zinging to shade at some appointed hour. The deafening gossip and argument, and the tree swelled with sound. The sparrows singing the song of a full tree. Where trees floated in summer, now their grey shapes fall unwelcome. The river, meeting frozen air, runs on under its glass roof. A young dog trots across and back, an inch from death, his shadow running under him. The moon's gaze has frozen everything. Even the canal is armed against her. A swan sits in the ice, his head hidden under a white shield. Can he survive the night? The moon leans back in her rocking chair. Yes, she says, quiet as death, he can. Your head in moonlight casts its shadow of hair on the crisp pillow, a map of itself. Roads in the snow. You've started down. I'll never catch you now. Another collaboration has been more recently with Dale Rawls, who teaches art at Catherine Gable School. And Steve Tilden here put me in touch with him on a program called Word and Hand, which was a matching of 6 visual artists with 6 writers. And I was very lucky to be asked to do this. And but when I went to meet Dale, neither of us was feeling completely sure we wanted to do it. We had this wonderful kind of matador ball kind of fencing around when both of us, I think, were wanting the other one to say, let's not do it. But then, but eventually I could see that around the walls were these wonderful Oriental inspired pieces, and so I started talking to him about the 8 traditional scenes of Japanese and Chinese art, which are evenings. They've been done. Every Japanese poet and every Chinese poet since the 13th century has done these 8 scenes, and all the printmakers have done them too. Evening snow, autumn moon, clearing weather, evening bell, fishing village at sunset, wild geese in last light, boats returning at evening, and night rain on the river. Those are the 8 scenes, and they're traditional, and they've been used over and over and over again in multiple combinations. And I gave my sort of little dissertation on that to him, and then I realized he knew all about it. And he said, let me start, and he gave me a piece which was, let's see, you can see a fragment of it on the cover here. He'd torn the label off a mandarin orange can, and he'd stuck it on right in the middle of a large white canvas, and on the can the words were Pacific Mandarin, and I could tell he was teasing. And it had some threads pulled off it, and it looked just like those square panels that the senior officials in the Chinese court have on their chests, which have phoenixes or tigers or whatever to indicate their rank. And this looked like something that had been torn off a person's chest. And of course this happened to all of the great poets of China and Japan. They went in for the exams which were the exams to be a ruler of a province. They were all exams in poetry. They all did very well because they were great poets. They were sent out to the province, and they couldn't rule because they were good poets. And so they got sent up into the mountains, and they went and wrote poetry for the rest of their lives. And it's a wonderful way of actually establishing a poetry dynasty. I don't know if it's a very good way of finding provincial governors. Anyway. We started exchanging scenes, and there were 8 of them, obviously, and I'll read 4 of them. Evening snow. Lamplight falls from my window, square on the snow's blank screen. In the shadows, but not forgotten, 10,000 desires lie curled. High in the tallest pine, a bird calls out a plaintive cadence. My friend the cat looks up at me, her face transfigured by greed. Autumn Moon. I wrote this actually in a workshop of Paul Ann's, and this was when my wife Grace was working in Texas most of each week, and that's the reason for the single star in this poem. Autumn Moon. The moon's boat sails alone tonight through choppy clouds. And did it gleam in your sky too with its single star? Remember the grove with its ancient oak trees, their branches joined across 400 years. The world is not too large. I feel you close, an orange slice exploding in my mouth. Wild geese in last light. Now this is a scene actually at Proposal Rock on the coast here. At night, mingled with dark water, we could hear the sea's long fury. Offshore, marooned in darkness, the great rock endured its battering. Beyond it lay cities so distant only their names were real. Suddenly, above us, the shadow of a ghost ship appeared. On the purple sky, wild geese flying south at last. A galley rowed by slaves from a conquered country, calling to each other in their harsh, forgotten tongue. And the last one. Boats returning at evening. They heard through the open door the ocean grinding its pebbles and the fishermen's songs out in the bay. The cook brought to the table 2 mackerel on a black lacquer tray. It was so long ago. He tried to place the shoreline, the striped tablecloth, the shredded ginger, but realized his memory had the misted outlines of an event that was still to happen. And in the year after I worked with Dale Rawls, Dale wasn't able to work with me, and oh no, he was. We worked 2 years together, but after that, Steve and I decided to work together. And Steve is a metal sculptor. These are his sculptures here. And I want to read one piece from an exchange we've done. We've done a number now. And this is a little portrait, actually, of my mother and father. My father and mother, actually. No, the other way around. And my mother wrote me, she visited me one time in, I was from Wales, but I went to school very young, actually, at the age of 9 in Windsor, and which is the other side of the country from Wales, for those of you who know England. And my mother once visited me in that school, and then she went back, and it was November the 5th, which is plot night in England. It's gunpowder plot night, and it's when everybody in England builds a huge bonfire and puts a Guy Fawkes on the bonfire and burns the guy to death. It's pretty impressive, and and she wrote me a letter after she'd visited me. She wrote me a letter which was I've lost the letter, but I remember it. It was almost pure poetry when she wrote it. She described how, as she went back in the train westwards across the country. The bonfires were first beginning, and then they grew, and then in the train she could see the bonfires at height, and then going down, and when she reached home in Wales, the bonfires had dwindled to nothing. And the other poem, my father was, among other things, a sculptor in slate and bronze, and so this is the other poem is a little portrait of him. So this is my mother. A half-century ago, leaving Windsor, that nest of singing birds, saw at dusk the hurried assemblages of tree branches, broken chairs, scavenged house timbers piled into heaps, some with the ragged-trousered sacrifice enthroned already. King of the old year, a necessary death. Speeding westwards into darkness, she saw the first bonfires lighted, a scent and starburst of stray rockets, then gradually in all directions round each fire a circle of lit faces, the flames now leaping, sparks and exhalations, Catherine wheels, Roman candles to celebrate old martyrdoms. At last the world of fire consumed itself, dwindled to glowing embers, cooled. She crossed the dark estuary, its air heavy with smoke. And my father, sleeping body, earth smell after rain, moles and badgers root in its arteries, and restlessly the dog fox hunts through thickets, across open fields, testing with his nose the still remembered secrets. Each memory, a dragon biting its own tail, workings of an abandoned pit. The sculptor sleeps on his bed of slate. His dreams are molten bronze poured into the crannies of his skull. Kings and queens like standing stones, spears and helmets in the cave mouth, relics of bear and hippopotamus, jawbone and pelvis, rib and shoulder blade, old texts deciphered, pottery fragments, days and nights half forgotten, fins of fossil fish moving in the darkness. And Steve did accompanying illustrations for all of these exchanges, but this is the one. This is my mother's portrait, and this is my father's portrait. They're intriguing to look at closely. The most recent collaboration, which all three of us have had, Steve and I have been collaborating with the composer Tomáš Svoboda on a piece. Steve made a for this exchange that I've just read apart from, he challenged me to see if I could translate. Well, the first thing he did was he took one of the poems in there and translated it into metal, like this, but lines, just continuous lines of metal like that, where each word was a hieroglyph. And then he said, "Now then, why don't I do a poem for you in metal and you translate it back into English," which is a slightly different exercise. And so he produced such a piece, and then he gave it to Tomáš Svoboda, and it sat around in Tomáš's house. And Tomáš at first didn't make anything of it, and then he suddenly had a theme in his head, which was the poem he'd seen in the metal, and that theme became a 3-movement piece, a piece for xylophone and prepared tape. Before we look at Steve's sculpture, I'd like to see if you can. This is a very faint recording of it, and you'll have to be very quiet, and you may not even hear it if you're quiet. Let's see. This is from the 3rd movement, and what I want you to listen to is how sinister it is, and how there's a sense of time passing, and also a sense of water dropping, but also how oriental it is. And none of that would mean anything to Tomáš if he were here. probably, it's fading to nothing now. You can kind of hear the approximate effect of that. When I heard the music, I went instantly to think about a book that I was reading, and it was the life of a 10th century Japanese poet, and he had been wonderfully translated by Robert Morgan into very academic translations. And the translations in the book, I felt, just cried out to be reworked into modern colloquial poems. And what I noticed was that something had happened to this man, Sugawara no Michizane, his name is, and he was in the Japanese court in the generation before the Lady Shikibu, the Tale of Genji author. And he had two disasters in his life. One disaster was he was sent as ambassador to an island where he didn't feel at home, and the second was when he was sent into exile by his enemies, and he died in exile. But those two disasters made him a great poet. And I want to read my response to the third movement of Tomasz's piece, which you heard a tiny piece of there. And I was listening to the water dripping, and I was listening to the time passing. And the piece is called Notes for Time, and it's called The Old Fisherman. The great moment in his life was when he met an old fisherman, and it was the first commoner probably he'd met in his life. And he suddenly realized what a common person's life was like. He had been a senior official in the Japanese court. The Old Fisherman. And all of these words are rough retranslations of a Japanese poet. I don't read Japanese. My boat has always struggled against the wind, and here I am again, drifting in strange country. My friend, the fisherman, old and alone, has just one task. His thin line shivers in the wind. He has no philosophy, just wants to spend each day like this. But winter has come early for my friend, who has no land, not even enough to stand a needle in. Pull oars all your life, you will stay poor. My friends tell me I'm wasting time with him, but what is better than conversation? I'm sorry it took us so long to find each other. And now I hear the old man has given up fishing. His little boat, he says, is filling up with tears. He'd like to be out on the swell, setting nets, but he's too old and decrepit to battle the winds. That fish hook was carved by his grandfather. He turns it in his hands and the tears fall. What life will he pass to his children? How will he feed and clothe his family? As a ploughman, his crops would fail. Herding sheep, he'd lose the flock. It's not that he lacks the courage to change. He just can't abandon what he did so well. This is why the old man is crying so bitterly. He dreamed of being a fisherman to the end. Longing for home, I wrote, let the eastern breeze carry your fragrance, plum blossoms. I may be gone, but don't neglect the spring. I watch the geese in their long line flying north and dream of clearing my name, but I will never see my family again. The hut with its thatched roof looks out on the dark ocean. I shall end my life right here. They will wrap my bones and bury them in this distant place. Imitating the ancients in their bamboo groves, let's drink a cup or two of wine and toss some verses back and forth. The hours fly past. No one can call them back. And look, it's dusk already. I think he was a great poet. The sympathy with the fisherman is very unusual for a court official at the Japanese court. These two lines, Steve took lines from the translations, and those two lines, Steve can outline them for you. Well, I'll just hold it. So here's this is how he translates into metal.
So, and now I hear, the old man has given up fishing. His little boat, he says. It's too sad. His little book, he says, is filling up with tears.
That's one direction in which Steve and I have worked, but the other direction is to go in that direction. After we finished our collaboration with Tomasz, and there was an exhibit in Blackfish Gallery where Steve is a member of the gallery. Steve had some sculptures left over, and this is the most flamboyant of them. And he said, okay, now then you translate these four into English. And that one's an interesting challenge to translate. The thing in the top right-hand corner is easy. That's a phoenix. It's pretty obvious that that's a phoenix. But these mechanical objects, this thing that's kind of I think I understood this actually when I first saw it, and I think I'm not very far from Steve's intentions here. These two mechanical things with the springs and the levers are things to launch birds. And the phoenix has been launched already. But the other one is yet to be launched, and it's probably going to be launched in the other direction if you think about it. And I was looking at that, and I was thinking, well, that's Aztec. It has to be Aztec, that object there. The other one's kind of a phoenix maybe from Iran or somewhere like that, but this is Aztec. And so I started working on a set of poems that derive from those four sculptures that Steve gave me. I can't explain more than that, but you'll hear there's one of the poems I'm just about to read has all of these birds in it. And this is what I'll finish with. Where I placed myself was because I began this reading with a tribute to my English publisher, and I've talked about other publishers I'm grateful to. But the friendship with my English publisher has been a very extraordinary thing. Every so often, we met frequently, but every so often he would say, okay, time for another book. And he would simply say, now I need another book from you. And then we'd simply assemble a book and he would publish it. Not many people get that kind of relationship with a publisher, and he's been my publisher all my life. And so I thought, okay, I want to write a set of poems about what it's like to be friends with a publisher and to grow up working together. And I found myself thinking about one of the great 16th century bibliographers. His name was Conrad Gesner. He's a famous guy, actually. And he and his publisher, Froschauer, Frosch means frog in German, they were both from Zurich. And they produced a book which was 4,000 pages long, and it had, this is a page from the book, and it had every known creature in the book. That book was translated actually into English by a very eccentric guy called Thomas Moffat. Sorry, yes, and it was called The History of Four-Footed Beasts. And this is a page from that English translation. But I was interested in the collaboration between a man and his publisher when the work they'd done together was to print 4,000 pages, a 4,000-page book, in 1,000 copies. Right? That's 4 million pages of printing, hand printing, filled with woodcuts, and you can imagine what that publishing task was like, even bigger than monochords. So these are very short poems, and I'll read them rather rapidly through. It's just an attempt to catch the relationship between this man and his publisher. Mist. Oh, he's writing to the publisher, by the way, in 1565, when the publisher's already been dead for a year. Mist. Some moments you remember always. Harsh clatter of bolts, tannery doors creaking open, our lake's October grey, the sun still asleep behind the East Hills. My uncle, whose garden was my school, suddenly dead. And now my father, the bear, killed in a pointless religious squabble. That morning a mist lay on the lake, hiding my whole world. An idea came. I would assemble a little park, my own paradise, a home for unicorns, fish and water buffalo, lizards and boa constrictors, nuthatches, red kites. I would saddle the tired old horse and start the search for specimens. I was 15, and now fate's bony finger was pointing the way. We live in ignorance, Frosh. That autumn day, riding along Newmarket to the West Gate, I passed your printing house without a glance. Tulips. Tell me if I'm wrong, Paul Ann. The Turks call the Turk word for a turban is tulipan. Is that right? Does that sound right to you? But I think they named the tulip is named for the shape of the turban in Turkish, and of course tulipanos in Spanish too. Tulips. Gesner was the great botanist of his age. There's no book in which he did flowers. They were going to publish the book of flowers. He did the most extraordinarily beautiful drawings, and Froschauer died before the book could be done. Tulips. His drawings survived, and the drawings were given to a German botanist professor in a university who wasn't interested in them and put them in his attic, and they were eventually discovered and published in the 19th century. You should see them on my page. Explosion of yellow, crimson, purple, watercolours glistening with the dew still on the petals. They are a shock to us, these mountain dwellers from Anatolia. Turbans, the Turks called them. They are so familiar. Of all the flowers, these make the hardiest travellers. Their roots journey across continents. 3 years ago, an Ottoman weaver placed handfuls of bulbs in the cloth he sent to Vienna. There, a tailor boiled some for his supper and threw out the rest. They rooted and bloomed, a 9 days' wonder. Clusius sent me the offspring. All curiosities end up here, where I treasure them. On the shore of this icy lake, the garden was always closest to my heart, its flowers blooming on terraces or painted on pages scribbled with notes. I was saving them for our last book together, another big folio full of woodcuts. Why did you leave me so suddenly? It is too hard to talk with a ghost. Our words fade in the mists over Lethe. In order. When did my mania begin for arranging the universe? Perhaps it was seeing the fish on that stall in Venice, gleaming like armour, sprats ranked with sprats, sardines shoulder to shoulder with sardines, all in perfect order. One could be a second Adam and label everything. I've seen you take the metal types from their cubbyholes in the case and set them letter by letter into words, then returning to their nesting places, sheets of text assembled and distributed. Our world may be at war, but language moves with quiet steps. In those disordered days, we composed new worlds, page after perfect page. Birds, and that's this piece. Birds. They range so docile on the shelf, paper alongside vellum. But we know books are winged creatures, secretly eager for flight. Some soar at once, others manage only a flutter to the nearest twig. Any book can be a phoenix. We launched 3 from the ashes of our exhaustion, quadrupeds, then fish, then birds, in Lucas's woodcuts made from life. It was our 4,000-page zoo. And if I spoke of unicorns, basilisks and salamanders and other fantastic creatures, who else can say he has held in his hands an Aztec hummingbird, small as a bee? Learning. My ticket out of medical school into public life was a dissertation. Is the brain or the heart the origin of sense and motion? It sounded more intelligent in Latin. Church clock. I hear the church clock strike all the dark hours. 2, 3, 4, 5. I am caught in a monster's jaws, then sometimes it is a wire fence, or a tight box, or a funnel I was thrust down into with no light at the far end. In this confinement, my thoughts loop into clockwork repetitions, curl on themselves, and I catalogue the 100 names of grasses, the colours of birds' eggs, varieties of flowers and their seed pods. There are other nights when an old memory swims up out of the lake. I'm climbing that first alpine peak, over ice fields to its sharp summit. I rehearse the pure joy of it. It is like folding a fresh laundered sheet, and then I can sleep till dawn silvers the window with a hint of morning. He was the first person to climb mountains in the Alps and to write about it. Hamadryads and satyrs. Remember our pedantic little book on milk and cheese, larded with references from ancient authors? Such erudition in the service of dairy products seems comic now. But I was 25 and eager to impress, and you were 50, the prince of Zurich printers. Perhaps you were happy to lend your name to a panegyric of Swiss cowherds and milkmaids, our native Philidas and Corridones. Or were you taken by its eccentric preface, praising the demigods, nymphs and oreads, naiads, hamadryads, fauns, satyrs, pans, mysterious as the mountain itself? Some people hide indoors like mice in winter. Others raise their faces to the stars. And a few climb for delight. I am one of these, and you set me on the first slopes. Frogs. In our big book of animals, the printer's device you chose was a child riding a frog. A pun on your name, of course, and a witty suggestion of growth through experience. So our folio strode into leather-bound libraries with a joking title page. But there was something else. A frog enjoys all the elements: water, sunlight, earth, air. Now at the very end, I see we would do well to be as adaptable as frogs. Everything. This is the last poem. I was the doctor at your deathbed a year ago, and a week later at my mother's. Now my turn has come. I dreamed last night I was bitten by a snake. Some messages we understand without a translator. They have carried me to my museum of curiosities, which for me is a memory palace. You know I tried to assemble everything, and almost succeeded. I hope I'm ready to leave it all. I wonder, is there laughter in heaven? Where you are, surely there is. Well, I shall know soon enough. Thank you very much.